Do you think that the dirty, smelly, and disease-ridden Middle Ages are nothing more than a historical curiosity? That people back then were doomed to live in filth, and that the concept of hygiene simply did not exist? Do you believe that only our modern civilization, with its countless shower stalls, antibacterial gels, and cleaning products, has been able to defeat foul odors and disease? What if everything you've been told about the dirty Middle Ages is only part of the picture? What if, with only primitive tools and incredible ingenuity, they actually knew much more about cleanliness than we can imagine? What if the real dirt isn't the medieval streets, but the blinders that prevent us from seeing the truth about the past? Get ready for a shocking dive into a world where every day was a struggle for survival, but cleanliness wasn't a forgotten ideal, but something vital. Watch this video to the end, and you'll learn not just dry facts, but striking details that will forever change your perception of cleanliness and make you look at yourself in a new light. When it comes to medieval food, the first thing that comes to mind is probably unsanitary conditions, rotten meat, and widespread poisoning. However, contrary to popular belief, medieval people had remarkable knowledge of food storage and preparation, which allowed them not only to survive, but also to enjoy a fairly varied diet. They did not know about bacteria, but their methods were remarkably effective in preventing food spoilage and disease. Historical fact: medieval cooks and housewives actively used salting, smoking, and drying to preserve meat, fish, and some vegetables. Salt was an incredibly valuable resource, sometimes worth its weight in gold, but without it, it was impossible to survive the winter. Meat such as pork and beef was heavily salted or soaked in the strong brine, which prevented the growth of bacteria by suppressing their life processes and drawing moisture out of the product. This process, known as salting, created an unfavorable environment for most pathogens. Smoking meat and fish over slowly smoldering wood not only gave the products a special flavor, but also created a bactericidal layer of smoke components on their surface, which significantly extended their shelf life. Smoke contains phenols and other antimicrobial compounds. Drying vegetables, herbs, and fruits in the sun or near a fire was also widespread and allowed vitamins and nutrients to be preserved by removing the moisture necessary for the growth of microorganisms. Did you know that some of these ancient preservation methods are still used today, remaining the basis of traditional cuisine in different parts of the world, from dried meat to dried fruit? This shows a deep understanding of natural processes and their effectiveness. The daily diet, of course, depended on social status and the season. Peasants mainly ate grains, barley, rye, and oats, which were used to bake coarse bread and cook porridge. These dishes, although simple, provided the necessary energy and fiber. An important way to keep food clean was to boil it thoroughly. Most dishes, especially porridge and soups, were cooked for a long time, which guaranteed that most harmful microorganisms in water and food were killed. Although there were no refrigerators, of course, there were primitive methods of cooling and storage. Food was often stored in deep cellars or pits, where the temperature remained consistently low even in summer, thanks to the natural insulation of the earth. Sometimes ice pits were used, where snow and ice were stored in winter and carefully covered with straw, sawdust, and earth to keep them cool for a long time, sometimes until the following winter. This allowed perishable foods such as milk, cheese, or fresh meat to be stored for short periods of time, especially for the nobility. Dairy products such as cheese and butter were also produced and stored, as the fermentation of milk turned it into a more stable product that was less prone to spoilage. Lactic acid bacteria inhibited the growth of harmful microorganisms, making cheese and fermented milk products safe to eat. But how did they manage not to get poisoned when the shelf life of products was not indicated on the packaging, and the only way to check freshness was to taste it? And what did they do with meat that started to smell suspicious? If you want to learn about their incredible methods of masking odors and risky culinary tricks, watch this video to the end. We'll explain why spices were so expensive and important, and how they helped not only with taste, but also with survival, often possessing powerful antiseptic properties capable of suppressing the growth of bacteria in spoiled meat. It wasn't just a matter of hiding the smell, but actively fighting the effects of spoilage. Medieval clothing may seem crude and unhygienic at first glance. However, behind this apparent simplicity lay a sophisticated system designed to maintain warmth, protect against the elements, and surprisingly, ensure relative cleanliness in conditions where washing was a luxury rather than a daily routine. It was not just clothing, but multi-layered protection, each element of which had its own function, and the materials were chosen based on their practical properties. Historical fact: the main materials for clothing were wool, especially for outer layers, and linen, for underwear. Wool has amazing properties. It retains heat well, even when wet, thanks to the special structure of its fibers, which trap air. It also repels water and dirt, as its surface is covered with a natural wax called lanolin, which creates a water-repellent barrier. In addition, wool has natural antibacterial properties, inhibiting the growth of microorganisms and preventing unpleasant odors. Linen underwear worn directly on the body was more hygienic, as it was easier to wash and dried quickly. Linen is also hypoallergenic, very durable, and absorbs moisture well, wicking sweat away from the body. Did you know that some medieval dyes, such as woad for blue or walnut leaves for brown, not only gave a bright color but also had antiseptic properties, providing additional protection for the fabric against bacteria and fungi? This was an unconscious but very useful property of their dirty fashion, which made clothes more resistant to damage. Layering was the key to warmth and hygiene. People wore several layers of clothing, a linen shirt or tunic directly on the body, then woolen stockings, pants or dresses, and on top, cloaks or capes. Linen underwear was changed and washed more often than outer clothing because it was lighter and dried faster, especially after boiling or soaking in an alkaline solution made from ash. It absorbed most of the dirt and sweat, protecting more expensive and difficult to care for woolen clothing from direct contact with the body. Outer garments were cleaned differently. They were regularly beaten to remove dust and dirt, shaken out, aired in the fresh air to eliminate odors, and cleaned with dry brushes. Greasy stains could be removed with ash or special clays that absorb grease, similar to modern absorbents. For deeper cleaning, detergents based on soap root or lye obtained from ash were used. Medieval tailors also used various tricks to extend the life of clothing and make it more practical. For example, sleeves and hems of outer garments were often made detachable or easily replaceable, as these parts wore out and became dirty the fastest. This allowed only the most worn parts to be replaced without affecting the entire expensive garment. Clothes were often altered and repaired rather than thrown away. Patches were the norm rather than a sign of poverty, and the art of mending was highly valued as every piece of fabric was precious. Family items were passed down from generation to generation, which required constant care and repair. But how did they deal with the unpleasant odors that inevitably accompanied clothes that were washed only once every few weeks or months? And what did they do about lice and fleas, which were constant companions of medieval man? If you think they just put up with it, watch this video to the end. The answers will blow your mind with their ingenuity and, at times, desperation. For example, to combat parasites, clothes could be frozen or fumigated with herbs. When you imagine a medieval person, the image of a dirty, unwashed character comes to mind. And although by our modern standards, hygiene left much to be desired, it would be a mistake to think that medieval English people did not care about cleanliness at all. On the contrary, they used many surprising and sometimes unexpected ways to maintain personal hygiene, adapting to the conditions of their era when there was no centralized water supply or factory-made soap. Historical fact: bathing, although not a daily ritual for most people, was much more common than is generally believed. There were public baths in towns, often located near rivers or lakes, where townspeople could wash themselves. Although their cleanliness left much to be desired by our standards, the very fact of their existence and popularity speaks to the need for bathing and the desire for cleanliness. Wealthy homes and castles had special bathing rooms where water was heated in large boilers and poured into wooden or stone tubs. Peasants could wash in rivers, lakes, or even in large wooden tubs at home, using heated water, often with the addition of lye from ash to enhance the cleansing effect. In addition, there was a practice of steam baths, similar to modern saunas, where people would steam themselves and then pour cold water over themselves. This was an effective way to cleanse the skin, stimulate blood circulation, and remove toxins through sweat. Did you know that some herbs, such as lavender, mint, rosemary, chamomile, and thyme, were not only used to add a pleasant scent, but also had antiseptic, anti-inflammatory, and healing properties, and were added to washing water and used as disinfectants? Hair and oral care were not completely ignored either. People combed their hair with combs often made of wood, bone, or horn to remove dirt, dandruff, and most importantly, parasites. Hair was washed with herbal decoctions, e.g., soapwort, horsetail, that helped cleanse the scalp, add shine to the hair, and make it less oily. For dental care, they used twigs from trees with hard bark, such as willow or oak, which they chewed to clean their teeth and gums of plaque, as well as herbs with abrasive properties, such as sage or mint. Some chronicles mention the use of powders made from crushed bark or ash for cleaning teeth, which, although abrasive, had whitening and cleansing properties. Rinsing the mouth with herbal decoctions, such as parsley or mint, was also common for freshening breath and eliminating inflammation. Unpleasant odors were combated with natural fragrances. People carried small bags of dried aromatic herbs and flowers, sachets with them, and used fragrant oils and floral waters to spray their clothes and rooms. Various aromatic essences derived from flowers and plants, such as rose water or lavender infusions, were used to mask body odor. Aromatic herbs were used in toilets, if there were any, and in crowded places, such as markets or public buildings, to mask the stench and create a more pleasant atmosphere. These herbs could also repel insects. But why, if they knew so much about herbs and their properties, were they unable to get rid of the widespread diseases that we now know are linked to unsanitary conditions and a lack of understanding about microorganisms? And why did their cities remain so dirty despite all these methods? If you want to learn the terrifying truth behind these seemingly clean habits and why disease continued to ravage the population, watch this video to the end. The answer will shock you with its cruelty and show you that desire alone is not enough for proper hygiene. When we think of medieval homes and streets, images of cluttered, smelly spaces where dirt was an integral part of the landscape often come to mind. While this is largely true, it would be unfair not to mention that medieval people surprisingly employed some methods to keep their homes and even the streets clean, although these were not always effective by modern standards. Their approaches were pragmatic and based on the necessities of life, dictated by the absence of centralized systems and limited resources. The floors in houses, especially peasant houses, were earthen or clay. To keep them clean, they were sprinkled with fresh straw or reeds. This straw not only created a warmer and softer surface, but also absorbed dirt, moisture, and odors, acting as a natural absorbent. The straw was changed regularly, and the old straw was thrown away, thus removing a significant amount of rubbish and waste that could become a breeding ground for pests and bacteria. The frequency of replacement depended on the family's wealth. In poor homes, this could be less frequent, but in wealthier homes, it was changed weekly or even more often. In wealthier homes, wooden floors were used, which were also swept and sometimes washed, although this required considerable effort and resources. To repel insects and give the straw a pleasant smell, fragrant herbs such as wormwood, mint, lavender, or rue were added, which also had mild insecticidal and repellent properties. Did you know that some of the herbs they use for bedding release phytoncides, natural antimicrobial substances that inhibit the growth of bacteria and fungi, unknowingly creating a healthier and more antiseptic environment in living spaces? Waste disposal in cities was much worse than in rural areas, where waste was often used as fertilizer. City authorities tried to combat the mountains of garbage by issuing decrees prohibiting the dumping of waste on the streets and requiring regular cleaning. There were even garbage collectors, people responsible for transporting waste outside the city, but their numbers and effectiveness left much to be desired. Due to the lack of adequate infrastructure and overcrowding, streets often remained dirty and waste accumulated, attracting rodents and insects. Nevertheless, a primitive form of sewage system existed in some large cities and castles. These were drainage ditches that carried waste outside the city walls or into the nearest bodies of water. Monasteries, which were centers of knowledge and hygiene, often had complex water supply and sewage systems, including aqueducts, drainage channels, and even primitive toilets with running water, which is astonishing and shows that knowledge of sanitation had not been completely lost. Pest control, such as rats and mice, was a constant problem due to the abundance of food waste and grain. Cats were used for this purpose, as they were indispensable helpers in the fight against rodents, as well as primitive traps and poisons made from plant ingredients. In barns and storerooms, grain was kept in containers or chests raised above the ground to reduce access by rodents. Insects were everywhere, and to combat them, smoke from certain herbs, such as wormwood, rosemary, and lavender, was used to fumigate rooms, and drafts were maintained in homes and regularly ventilated. Despite these efforts, it was impossible to completely defeat the pests. But why? If they tried so hard to keep their homes clean, did their cities remain breeding grounds for disease? And what did they do with human waste that did not end up in the sewers? If you want to learn about the shocking methods medieval cities used to clean up human waste and how this led to epidemics, watch this video to the end. We will reveal the dark secrets of medieval toilets and their impact on health. For example, you will learn about cesspools and chamber pots, the contents of which were often simply thrown out onto the streets. Medieval medicine was, of course, a far cry from modern medicine. The lack of knowledge about germs, effective antibiotics, and modern anesthesia made fighting disease extremely difficult and often deadly. However, contrary to popular belief, medieval people were not completely helpless in the face of illness. They possessed extensive knowledge of medicinal plants, folk medicine, and some surgical procedures, which, although primitive, sometimes saved lives and alleviated suffering. Monasteries played a key role in the development of medicine and the preservation of medical knowledge. Monks were the keepers of ancient texts, including the medical treatises of Hippocrates and Galen, and grew medicinal herbs in their monastery gardens, herbaria, which were the pharmacies of their time. They created various decoctions, ointments, and plasters using recipes borrowed from ancient sources and accumulated over the centuries. Knowledge of herbs was passed down from generation to generation and formed the basis of folk medicine, which was accessible to most of the population. Antiseptic plants such as plantain for healing and stopping bleeding, chamomile, anti-inflammatory, yarrow, hemostatic, and calendula for tissue regeneration were used to treat wounds. Decoctions of these herbs were used to wash wounds to prevent infection, which was critically important before the discovery of antibiotics. Plants containing alkaloids, such as opium, poppy, belladonna, or mandrake, could be used for pain relief, but their use was extremely risky due to their high toxicity and narrow therapeutic window. Did you know that medieval surgeons, despite the lack of modern anesthesia and antiseptics, were able to perform quite complex operations, such as amputations, often with cauterization of wounds to stop bleeding, removing stones from the bladder, and even trepanation of the skull to relieve pressure or treat epilepsy, relying on the speed and precision of their movements and sometimes on the use of alcohol or opium to partially stun the patient? Bloodletting was one of the most common but often harmful treatments. It was believed that diseases were caused by an imbalance of 4 fluids, humors in the body, blood, phlegm, yellow and black bile, and bloodletting was supposed to restore this balance. Special lancets, scarifiers, or even leeches were used for this purpose. This method, of course, often weakened the patient, but in some rare cases, such as high blood pressure or certain types of inflammation, it could bring temporary relief. To reduce fever, cool compresses and herbal decoctions with antipyretic properties, such as willow bark, containing salicylates or elderberry, were used. Hygiene during childbirth was extremely poor due to a lack of understanding of asepsis, which led to very high mortality rates among women in labor and newborns from childbirth fever and other infections. However, midwives who delivered babies often had practical knowledge of how to help women and used various herbs to relieve pain and speed up the delivery process. In some cases, they could even perform primitive maneuvers to change the position of the fetus or use tools such as special hooks. Even in the harsh conditions of the Middle Ages, people, especially members of the nobility, paid attention to body care, although their ideas about beauty and hygiene were very different from ours. They used natural remedies available in their environment and created their own cosmetic recipes. These methods were not only about external attractiveness, but also about maintaining health in the absence of modern medicine. as clean skin and hair were considered a sign of well-being. Various herbal decoctions and natural detergents were used to wash hair and skin. For example, decoctions of soapwort, saponaria, which contains natural saponins that produce foam and have cleansing properties, were used to cleanse the hair. Lye made from ash or egg yolks was also used. Chamomile was used to lighten hair, and nettle was used to strengthen and add shine, as well as to combat dandruff. For skincare, oils such as olive, almond, and flaxseed, herbal infusions, rosewater, calendula, and thyme decoctions, and animal fat-based ointments, often lanolin or lard, with added herbs were used to moisturize, soften, and protect the skin from cold and wind. Did you know that even back then there were primitive forms of deodorants? To eliminate unpleasant body odors, powders made from crushed aromatic herbs and spices such as iris, violet root, cloves, or cinnamon were applied to the skin to absorb moisture and mask odors. Facial and hand skin care was also important, especially for the nobility, as pale skin was considered a sign of nobility and distinguished them from peasants working under the sun. Women used masks made of honey, milk, and oatmeal to soften and moisturize the skin, as well as to nourish it. Lemon or vinegar infusions were used to lighten the skin, although these could be quite harsh and cause irritation. Hands, which were constantly working and exposed to external factors, were softened with rich creams and ointments made from beeswax and oils. Simple tools such as wooden or bone nail files were used for nail care and were cleaned regularly. Wealthy people could afford manicures and pedicures, which were performed by servants. Perfume played a very important role in the upper classes, as a pleasant scent was a sign of status and wealth and also helped to mask other, less pleasant odors. Perfumes and aromatic waters made from flower essences, rose, violet, jasmine, orange blossom, and spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, were very expensive and were used to scent the body, clothing, and rooms. These fragrances not only served to attract and create a pleasant image, but were also believed to have healing properties and could protect against disease, as bad smells were considered to be a source of infection. Fighting parasites was a constant part of personal hygiene, even for the wealthy, as lice and fleas were ubiquitous. Combs made of ivory, wood, or metal with very fine teeth were used to comb lice and nits out of hair and beards. Clothes were periodically burned over a fire for wool, or aired out in the cold in winter to kill parasites. Although it was impossible to get rid of them completely, these measures helped control their numbers and prevent excessive reproduction. When we talk about cleanliness in the Middle Ages, it is important to distinguish between personal hygiene and the cleanliness of public spaces, especially in cities. The latter was much more complex and posed a constant challenge for city authorities, who, despite their best efforts, often failed in the face of a growing population and limited resources. Nevertheless, remarkable attempts were made to create a semblance of order and cleanliness that seem naive today, but were revolutionary at the time. In some large cities, such as London, municipal regulations existed as early as the 12th to 13th centuries, obliging citizens to clean up rubbish in front of their homes and prohibiting the disposal of waste in rivers and streets. There were even special positions of street cleaners who collected garbage and took it outside the city. This was the first step toward a centralized sanitation system. In London, there were primitive drainage ditches along the streets designed to carry away rainwater and liquid waste, but they often became clogged and turned into open sewers, spreading foul odors. Did you know that some cities even impose fines for non-compliance with cleanliness rules in an attempt to force residents to keep things tidy? This shows that the problem of dirt was recognized, but the methods of combating it were extremely limited. Markets and fairs, being centers of trade and public life, were particularly problematic places in terms of hygiene. Huge amounts of waste accumulated here. Food scraps, animal entrails after slaughter, manure. To maintain order in the markets, rules were also issued requiring regular cleaning and waste disposal. Livestock was often slaughtered directly in the markets, which further exacerbated unsanitary conditions. However, in some cities, separate areas for slaughterhouses were located on the outskirts to reduce the spread of odors and waste. Drinking water sources, wells and fountains, were kept as clean as possible. In many cities, aqueducts or systems of wooden and lead pipes were built to deliver clean water from sources outside the city. However, a lack of understanding about germs meant that water was often contaminated by sewage, causing outbreaks of dysentery and cholera. Churches and monasteries were generally the cleanest and most hygienic places in a medieval town. Monks followed strict rules of hygiene, including regular washing and keeping their quarters clean. Monasteries often had complex water supply and sewage systems, as well as separate bathing rooms. But why, with such islands of cleanliness, did most cities remain hotbeds of infection? And what prevented the spread of this knowledge and these methods to the whole society? If you want to learn about the social and economic barriers that prevented universal cleanliness and how poverty and ignorance defeated even the best intentions, watch this video to the end. We will reveal the shocking truth about how class inequality affected hygiene and health in medieval society. The issue of waste disposal in the Middle Ages was one of the most pressing and unresolved problems, directly affecting the hygiene and health of the population. The lack of centralized collection and processing systems meant that waste became a source of disease and foul odors, defining the appearance of medieval towns and villages. But how did people manage to live in such conditions? And were there any attempts to deal with this problem? Human excrement, animal manure, food waste, construction debris, and ash from hearths were simply thrown into the streets, ditches, or nearby bodies of water. In cities, there were so-called night pots, the contents of which were simply poured out of windows onto the street in the morning with a cry of "Beware, filth! Garde l'eau!" This was the cause of widespread unsanitary conditions and a source of constant stench. However, there were also more advanced systems. In some castles and monasteries, there were wardrobes, primitive toilets located in protruding parts of the walls, from where waste fell directly into a moat or river. Did you know that even such a primitive method of disposal could be deadly when enemies during a siege could use these cesspools to spread disease inside the fortress? Manure was a valuable fertilizer for fields, so it was collected and used in agriculture. However, in cities, it accumulated in huge quantities on the streets, especially where livestock was kept or animals passed through. This manure attracted insects and rodents and spread disease. Garbage also accumulated in huge piles on the outskirts of cities, becoming a breeding ground for infections and an attractive place for stray animals. Burning garbage was a rare practice, as it required a lot of fuel and was not always safe. However, some waste, such as wood waste and straw, could be burned in hearths for heat. Metal and glass waste was rarely recycled, as the technology for doing so was primitive or non-existent. Most of this waste was simply buried or discarded. But what happened when the trash accumulated in such quantities that it began to threaten the lives of city dwellers? And how did people cope with the constant presence of rodents and insects that swarmed in these mountains of waste? If you think they just put up with it, watch this video to the end. We will tell you about the most desperate attempts by city authorities to combat this problem and how a lack of basic knowledge about hygiene led to disaster. One of the most unpleasant and widespread problems of the Middle Ages, directly related to hygiene, was the mass spread of parasites, lice, fleas, ticks, and scabies mites. These invisible enemies were constant companions of every person, regardless of social status, and the fight against them was a daily, though often unsuccessful, battle. They were not just a source of discomfort, but also carriers of deadly diseases. Lice were so widespread that they were considered practically normal. Their presence on the head and body did not cause the same disgust as it does today, and was perceived as an inevitable part of life. To combat them, people used frequent combs made of wood, bone, or ivory to comb their hair and beards. Sometimes the hair was treated with decoctions of herbs with insecticidal properties, such as wormwood or tansy. Fleas were an even greater scourge, especially for those who lived in houses with straw floors and kept animals. They carried the plague, which made them particularly dangerous. To repel fleas, people used bundles of fragrant herbs hung in their homes and regularly changed the straw on their floors. Did you know that people wore special pouches with aromatic herbs or even pieces of sulfur under their clothes to repel parasites, which was a primitive version of modern repellents? Scabies was also widespread and caused by microscopic mites. It led to unbearable itching and skin rashes. Sulfur ointments were used to treat scabies, which were quite effective, but had a strong, unpleasant odor. Skin infections caused by scratching and dirt were common and often led to boils and abscesses. Rats and mice were constant companions of humans, especially in cities. They swarmed in barns, basements, and houses, destroying food supplies and spreading diseases, including the plague. Cats, primitive traps, and even trained dogs were used to combat them. However, due to the huge amount of garbage and unsanitary conditions, it was almost impossible to completely get rid of rodents. But why, despite their constant struggle, were medieval people unable to truly defeat these parasites? And why did they seem unaware of their role in spreading deadly diseases? If you want to learn about the profound ignorance of the time in the field of microbiology and how that ignorance cost them millions of lives, watch this video to the end. We will reveal the shocking details of their struggle against an invisible enemy and show why their cleanliness was just an illusion in the face of a real threat. In the daily life of medieval people, tableware and kitchen utensils played no less important a role than in the modern world. Although the materials and cleaning methods were very different, the desire for cleanliness, especially when it came to food, was quite evident. They used simple but effective methods to maintain hygiene in the kitchen, which helped prevent food spoilage and disease. Most tableware was made of clay, ceramics, wood, or tin. Wooden utensils such as bowls, spoons, and dishes were the most common, especially among peasants, as wood was an affordable and easy-to-work material. Such utensils were regularly washed with hot water, if available, and sand or ash to remove food residue and grease. Ceramic tableware, especially unglazed, was porous and could absorb odors and grease, so it was cleaned thoroughly. Scrapers and stiff brushes made of natural fibers were used for particularly greasy or burnt areas. Did you know that some types of ceramic tableware, especially glazed ones, could be toxic due to the use of lead glaze, which released poisonous compounds when in contact with acidic foods? Metal tableware, such as pots and pans, was made of iron, copper, or bronze. It was more expensive and was mainly used in wealthy homes and castle kitchens. Metal cookware was cleaned with sand, ash, and vinegar to remove grease and prevent rust. Copper required special care as it could oxidize and release harmful substances, so it was cleaned regularly and sometimes tin-plated, covered with a thin layer of tin. Water hygiene was critically important. Water for drinking and cooking was taken from wells, rivers, or springs. Although they did not know about germs, they intuitively understood that water from stagnant bodies of water was more dangerous. Water was often boiled, especially for brewing beer and ale, which not only made the drink safer, but also served as an excellent means of preservation. Clay jugs were used to store water. These could be porous, allowing for easy evaporation, which cooled the water slightly. Cutlery was simple: wooden or tin spoons and knives. Forks were rare and only appeared in everyday use in the late Middle Ages, and even then, only among the nobility. People ate mainly with their hands, so washing hands before meals, although not always thoroughly, was an important aspect of hygiene. Basins of water and sometimes herbal infusions that produced a light foam were used for washing hands. But how did they manage not to poison themselves from repeated use of the same dishes, which could not be sterilized in our understanding? And why, despite all their efforts, was food poisoning so common? If you want to learn about the most shocking habits of medieval cuisine that would seem bizarre to us today, and how they coped with the consequences of these habits, watch this video to the end. We will reveal the secrets of their survival on the border between cleanliness and chaos. Their desire for cleanliness was different from ours. It was less visible, less sterile, but no less important for their survival. They knew how to preserve food, how to care for their clothes and bodies using natural remedies, and how to maintain relative order in their homes. However, limited resources, a lack of scientific knowledge about microbes, and often completely unsanitary conditions in cities turned this struggle into a Sisyphean task. Perhaps the main lesson we can learn from this is that cleanliness is not just about technology, but also about attitude. Medieval people, though surrounded by filth, nevertheless found ways to live and survive using their ingenuity and the gifts of nature. Their struggle for cleanliness, though imperfect, was constant and desperate. And that is what makes their efforts truly remarkable. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the secrets of medieval hygiene and want to learn more amazing and shocking facts about the lives of our ancestors, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Share this video with friends who still believe in myths about the dirty Middle Ages, and write in the comments what other historical secrets you would like us to reveal. See you in the next video, where we will continue to break stereotypes and open your eyes to the incredible past.